And I also, I just follow your tweets. So I wanted to show some of them and get you to expand on them.
Sure.
The first one, the U.S. doesn't import that much Russian oil, and the U.S. doesn't set oil prices by itself. OPEC also determines prices. New U.S. oil production will take months, if not years, to get online. Either way, this puts a giant target on the backs of water protectors and land defenders. I assume you mean, obviously, if we're going to do more domestic production, whose backs, I mean, who's those pipelines going to be going? Where's those pipelines going to be going through?
Exactly. And like, states governors like Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota, has really pushed for this kind of what she calls new generation or next generation legislation, although it's been challenged, luckily, to criminalize specifically Lakota water protectors who are protesting oil and gas infrastructure. Of course, that bill that she had introduced has been watered down for civil rights concerns. But nonetheless, the kind of sweeping package of ALEC legislation, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council, has created kind of model bills to be passed in state legislators to essentially over-criminalize and over-police indigenous-led movements against oil and gas infrastructure. And we've seen this response, by the oil and gas industry. Not only in terms of bills passing through legislators, but also in the attacks on things such as the Indian Child Welfare Act. My friend and colleague, Rebecca Nagel, has done an excellent job in exposing the links of the fossil fuel industry, to these attacks on Indian child welfare, because essentially they see tribal sovereignty as an obstacle to oil and gas expansion in the United States.
Right. Absolutely. And I also wanted to read this one. You pointed out a New York Times story. Socialist response to war in Ukraine has put some Democrats on edge. The only people on edge are those pushing for war. NATO advances militarism, nuclear proliferation, bombs, guns, fascist Contras, and sanctions. The opposition of peace. I think that's such an important point because honestly, I've been clear. I'm opposed to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but you'll never hear on CNN or any of these outlets that, well, Russia does have valid concerns about NATO. How would the United States feel if Canada or Mexico was part of an anti-America coalition and other countries were giving them weapons? I mean, it's so I don't think that condones invading and killing innocent civilians, but you don't really hear the context from the military industrial complex, particularly all these, military, retired generals parading our cable news screens. Can you kind of expand on what you were saying about NATO and, frankly, fascism?
Yeah, I first read about NATO when I was in high school because I had an inkling towards being anti-war when the United States invaded Afghanistan for the first time, and then also invaded Iraq. And I began reading Noam Chomsky, who actually explained like why NATO existed. And as a young high school kid, I was like, it was in my mind that this was kind of a default position of the anti-war movement, whether you're on the left or not, or you're a progressive, it doesn't matter. And that was always in my mind. And so I've always kind of kept that, like that I didn't think it was a very radical position, to be honest, to be critical of NATO, because NATO is a Cold War relic. It was created specifically to contain the Soviet Union. And so why it existed after the fall of the Soviet Union, to me, like, doesn't make sense. And in fact, Russia has tried to join NATO in the past. And Russia has actually led joint operations with NATO, whether it was the bombing of Afghanistan or, standing back and let NATO bomb like Libya. They took a different stance in Syria, but it's a whole nother question. But it's important to kind of point this out because it's NATO's solution. It's a military alliance first and foremost. And there's news coming out right now. I think Ilhan Omar tweeted this morning or maybe this afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in, that she was really kind of doubtful of just pumping all this military grade weaponry into Ukraine, because it's going into the hands of militias that are unregulated, and a lot of them are associated with the far right. It's not to say that the entire Ukrainian defense forces are Nazis, but in many ways, Putin's kind of denazification myth is like, or accusation against Ukraine is like a self-fulfilling prophecy, because a lot of far right trackers are showing like, look in the Telegram channels. I follow some of them. I've been following the kind of the movements of American soldiers, veterans into these far right militias. It's actually kind of phenomenal. It's happening in plain view, but because of the jingoism and the propaganda that has been spewed by American corporate media, it's people are literally supporting, and I don't think they're like doing this in a meaningful way. I don't think they're actually supporting like Nazis. They're like, oh, I endorse Nazism, but there's almost like blinders. Like ideology is so strong that they can't see it. Even NATO posted a tweet for International Women's Day of a Ukrainian territorial defense unit, a woman who had the Black Sun neo-Nazi badge on her military uniform. And again, I don't think that was intentional, but it shows the levels of of far right kind of capital, like they're exploiting this conflict as much as Russia and the United States are exploiting this conflict. And at the end of the day, who pays? Average civilians, everyday people pay for the costs of war, and I think that's the real tragedy here.
And also, we should know PBS interviewed a Ukrainian soldier who was a neo-Nazi and literally had like a portrait behind him, I think, of a Nazi.
Stepan Bandera, yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you also, as white people, I know you're called woke if you acknowledge this, but white people have privilege, some more than others, but we all have it. And it's just been striking to me. Obviously, we've seen what's going on at the border between Ukraine and Poland, and there's been non-white people turned away. There's been reports of foreign students, African students that have been traveling to get out of Ukraine and kicked off trains and things like that. And I even see it to a lesser degree just where I live driving around, because it's really striking seeing like you literally see outside of homes Ukrainian flags or the Ukrainian colors, and I'm like, hell, I've never seen that for Yemen. I've never seen mostly white people. Not that they shouldn't support Ukraine. It's not an either or, but it certainly is a very, very different standard in terms of the overwhelming support among Americans for the people of Ukraine and the media versus crickets that we've seen for refugees in Syria, Yemen, Somalia. I mean, I could go on and on. And I'm sure that's been quite obvious to you as well.
Yeah, I mean, what the war in Ukraine has exposed is a global division of humanity in terms of those who live almost daily with war, famine, impoverishment, and those who are relatively insulated from those experiences or perceived to be privileged enough to be insulated from those experiences in terms of Europe, itself. And like, there were several commentators, on BBC who had pointed this out. They were like, at the risk of sounding like racist, essentially they were saying like, this is, this shouldn't be happening in a so-called civilized, country. Yeah. And so those have really come to the surface, and it shows that like, it shows the limits of sympathy and empathy in terms of when it comes to, the Syrian refugees, the children who were washing up on the shores of Europe. And didn't get the same kind of sympathy and didn't get the same kind of, nuanced analysis in terms of how perhaps the countries that they were fleeing to are also fueling a civil war in a country like Syria itself. And so I think that's an important, point to point out, but it's also important to point out that it's, the kind of far right in the United States, Canada, and the Anglo kind of sphere are also exploiting this opportunity and saying like, this is, Ukraine is European, Russia is too far, Russia and Russians, I should say, have fallen from grace of whiteness. They've become Asians, essentially. There was a Wall Street Journal op-ed that compared Putin to Genghis Khan. And so the automatic reflex response is to turn this into race war. And it's a very, very tragic situation because, like, as you pointed out, we do see the kind of different degrees of humanity that are granted empathy and caring versus those who are not. And I think the world, these countries where these students are coming from, these international students are coming from, need to weigh in and hold the European Union and its countries accountable for the way that they've not only treated war refugees in this situation, but the way that they've treated war refugees from countries that they've also bombed and pillaged themselves.
And lastly, I wanted to ask you, Biden's poll numbers have skyrocketed after the State of the Union. I think a lot of it has to do with, what's going on in Ukraine and Russia and his response. His handling of Ukraine, I think, was up like 18% or something like that. His handling on coronavirus, all these things. So it seems like Americans have a bit of a selective memory. They forget about all the broken promises of Biden and Democrats, of course, Republicans as well. But when America starts beating the drum for war, and I would say that the media and Biden himself, they kind of portrayed that they didn't want Russia to invade Ukraine, but there was a whole lot of, drumming for war on these channels. What does that say to you that his poll numbers have shot up, seeming that people are forgetting about, a mass eviction, basically letting COVID go and, normalizing it, not fighting really for Build Back Better and those kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, it's tragic. Like, there are people in my family who are still getting COVID. I know
My dad right now has COVID.
Yeah, I mean, my dad got it last week, and we had a scare that I had it, and then I got sick with I got sick with a normal cold, I guess, which was very jarring because I haven't been sick in, several years because of, just social isolation. But and I also have friends who've a good friend of mine just lost her son to COVID, and so it's tragic. Like, I think I haven't looked at the numbers today, but I do know yesterday they were at 1,500 daily average deaths in the United States from COVID, and it just shows that the economy itself is in tatters. That this has impacted like everyday working people. But the only solutions that we get and the only funding packages that are put through Congress with like near zero opposition are for guns, bombs, and police. And so it's very, very cynical in this moment in time for somebody like Biden to use his State of the Union address to essentially denounce a defund the police movement when, just here in the Twin Cities, we had Amir Locke, who was executed by police officers in a no-knock raid. We can get more police, we can get more no-knock raids, but the housing prices in Minneapolis and across the country have skyrocketed. Like, real estate is off the charts, and now because of U.S. Somewhat because of U.S. intervention, but also just the way that global oil prices work, gas prices are going up. And they're going to impact everyday, Americans. Like, at the end of the day, like when average people think of energy policy in the United States, they think of their heating bill and how much it costs at the pump to put in, to fill up their gas tank. And the tragedy of that is, yeah, we shouldn't, there should be limits on oil and gas, and, we should be transitioning away, but we don't have an alternative. There's no alternative to build like a decent, public transportation that is prioritized around poor working people, right? That's the priority. Instead, it's, we live in an oligarchy. If Russia has done anything, it's exposed that, yeah, it's an oligarchy. It's run by oligarchs, but so too is the United States, for the way that they've thrown out working poor people at the behest of, the guns and money people. So that's a reality that we're facing right now in this kind of lead up, to war, as well as the kind of end, quote unquote, of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thanks for watching, and make sure to tune in to Status Coup's daily live stream Monday through Thursday at 5 o'clock Eastern Time and Fridays at 4 o'clock Eastern Time.